service transition. So in service transition, we're focusing on the long-term change management and release practices. We want to be mindful of how we're transitioning these things into the live environment. So there's a lot of focus here on mediation of risk. We can't eliminate risk entirely, and sometimes if the potential value for the organization is high enough, we may be willing to bear a higher level of risk. So again, we talk about mediating or optimizing the risk for the organization. And to effectively get these services from the design phase into operation, there are a number of processes that we follow. So we're going to talk about IT service asset and configuration management. We're going to talk about change management, release and deployment management, and knowledge management. Some of these processes do span multiple phases of the life cycle. I would point at knowledge management here specifically because we may be capturing knowledge even prior to the transition phase of the life cycle, but it's during this phase of the life cycle that we will perform most of the activities related to each of these processes. A note about IT service asset and configuration management. So we do use the terms asset and configuration management interchangeably. So in the original versions of ITIL, we referred to the process as asset management, but then it was thought that it focused too much on the financial kind of record-keeping inventory practice. So we shifted focus and started calling it configuration management, which was more along the needs of IT to really keep track of the infrastructure and the relationships between and among the various configuration items or assets. And then we kind of, in version 3, combined the two together, and now we call it IT service asset and configuration management. But we may use either asset or configuration management still for short when we're referring to this process. Among the activities in service transition are transition planning and support, service validation and testing, which is very important to release management, and change evaluation. And I have that highlighted here because it was a new addition in the version 2011 release of the ITIL framework. So still considered ITIL v3, but there were some changes or additions in 2011 that I've highlighted. So the first process we'll talk about here, IT service asset and configuration management. So when we're talking about this process, really the focus here is on configuration items or CIs. They are typically include hardware and software. It can be really anything though within the infrastructure. The important thing is that we're keeping track, as I mentioned before, when we're talking about configuration management, we are keeping track of the relationship data. The configuration management information should be informing all of our IT decisions. So there's the old joke about the end user who called into the service desk. And this is usually attributed to IBM, like a lot of older stories are. But when they called the service desk, they were complaining about the L key on their keyboard was stuck. So the technician had them bang on a little bit and tried a number of different things. And the user indicated, no, the L key was still stuck. So the IT help desk person told them, well, you know, just take your keyboard and kind of lift it up maybe a few inches or maybe about a foot off your desk, and then just drop it on your desk and see if that jiggles it enough to release that stuck key on your keyboard. So the user said, well, oh, okay, hold on just a second. And the technician heard a very loud crash on the other end, and the end user said, you know, I don't think that worked, and my laptop just isn't even turning on at all anymore. And of course, the joke there is that the technician didn't have the correct information about that end user's PC, didn't realize that it was a laptop and not a desktop, and unfortunately probably gave them the incorrect information, made a poor decision about how to provide appropriate support for the stuck key on the keyboard. So the hope and expectation here is that the CIs should be tracked, and there should be relationships between and among the CIs, and also between the CIs and perhaps the owners, so who is responsible for that particular piece of equipment. When we're talking about tracking the CIs, of course, we're talking about CMDBs, or Configuration Management Databases. And in version 3, they went one step beyond that, and now they call it a CMS. The argument there was that there was this federation of CMDBs. There wasn't just a single CMDB often. And the important thing, again, was that there be relationships between the CMDBs, but that there might be multiple sources, and they would all fall under this umbrella that we call a CMS. So you may have BMC's BCM product to keep track of the workstation, or you may have the ADDM to keep track of the servers and the application relationships. You may have a number of different tools that federate the information into the primary CMDB or CMS. It allows you to make better decisions for incidents, and as we'll see in just a moment, it should be informing the decisions we make about changes. So understanding how a change to one server or database may impact a number of different systems. Another part of the CMS is the Definitive Media Library. It used to be called the Definitive Software Library, but they've expanded this concept to incorporate not just software, but also license information and documentation. When we're talking about the Definitive Media Library, it used to be a big cabinet that housed all of the CDs and other media that we had for the software that we purchased. Now, of course, it's often just downloads and executables, and those still housed in a central location, such as a network drive, with appropriate levels of security applied to it. At this point, I'm going to pause for just a moment before I get into change management to see, Nancy, if there have been any questions.
Yeah, hi, Nikki. I do want to point out that if those in the audience do have any questions, they're welcome to enter those questions in the Q&A section, which you'll find down the lower right-hand side of your screen. I do believe that's where it's located. I do have one question.
Okay.
That has come in, and it's regarding your mention of documentation of the CMDB.
Okay.
So I understand that documents like policy documents, not just documents about software, but policy documents are included in the CMDB. Is there a need for these documents to go through change control?
So we'll talk about change control, as I mentioned, in just a few minutes, but short answer would be yes. Anything that's in the CMDB or in the DML should be under change control. So on the previous slide, I mentioned all CIs should be under the control of change management. So to the extent that they're under the control of change management will depend on the policies of the organization. So for example, it's unlikely that the documentation would be presented before the Change Advisory Board, for example, but there should be some level of approval or review, excuse me, by either a configuration librarian or other specialist before that's put into the DML and then therefore into the CMDB.
Okay, thank you. We have no other questions at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So moving on to change management, and change management as it sounds when you're talking about changes and transitions. Change management really is the core process of the transition lifecycle. In change management, I mentioned we are looking to optimize risk to the organization, not necessarily eliminating it altogether. We want to enable changes that will benefit the business. We want to minimize, we can't always eliminate, but we want to minimize disruption and incidents caused by changes. We want to establish procedures, and a lot of times, when we're talking about ITIL, ITIL is intended as a framework, and as a framework, it is up to the organization's interpretation. So it will tell us that we should have a documented process and procedure for change management. It gives guidelines as to what those processes and procedures should be, but it is not always black and white. There is a lot of room for interpretation, and especially when we're talking about smaller organizations. There is not a one-size-fits-all mentality when we're talking about ITIL. But it is important that you have procedures and processes that are documented, that just to help inform the organization and even beyond IT, to help the business to understand what it is that IT does and what the procedures are. For example, if they need to interface with IT, if they, on the business side, want to submit a request for change. And that's something that's important to remember. This last bullet here, to expand the request process to include all customers and users. So there should be some type of customer-facing, whether it be a form or other mechanism for the end users themselves to be able to submit requests for change to the organization. So it could be something as simple as, I'd like a new report in the finance application that we use. There could be larger scale changes. So, for example, the CEO has been hearing about Windows 10 and feels that the IT organization should start rolling that out to within the infrastructure. So, there should be a process to include all of the customers and users. Something I'll point out here is for BMC products, and specifically RemedyForce and Remedy, there is a process model that's already published that's part of those applications. So there is a prescribed workflow that takes advantage of the features of those applications, and the processes can be downloaded. There is a Visio type diagram or a workflow chart that takes you through the individual processes down to the very specific work instruction level. So if you have either of those products and haven't taken a look at that, I would encourage you to take a look at that process model. On the RemedyForce side, it's called alignability, and on the Remedy side, it's called the service management process model.